Hi everybody, this is Mike Allan for MLQplus. One of the questions I get asked quite a lot about is, can you explain the model behind MLQ? And given that I've got a report, how do I coach my client using that report? So I'm going to talk a little bit today about the model for MLQ. MLQplus, and then also a little bit about how you use the report to then coach your client through and what that coaching might look like. I'm not going to explain a coaching model. Everybody has their own. Obviously, there are some really well-known ones. More around how MLQplus report and the model, the full range leadership model, can help you develop a leader's behaviors and skills as a leader to obviously achieve the outcomes of leadership, which are always the same. That leader wants to get extra effort, obviously wants to be highly effective, and also wants to get satisfaction from the people that they lead, and thereby gets the result that they're looking for. So the first thing to understand about the full range leadership model, which is the model that MLQplus uses and measures a leader by, is that there are essentially 9 factors to that model. There are 5 transformational behaviours. There are 2 transactional factors, and there are 2 passive avoidant behaviors, which for all intents and purposes, the easiest way to understand it are those are the behaviors that you want to minimize as much as possible. So the easiest way to understand this is the 5 transformational behaviors. You want them to be as large as you possibly can. So you want people to doing those behaviors as much as they can, at the right place at the right time, in order to develop the transformational behaviors. Then there are 2 transactional behaviors that you want to be okay. You don't want them to be done all the time, and you don't want them to be too big, because as we'll discuss later on, if they are too big, they actually work against you. So you want 5 transformationals to be as large as you can, 2 transactional behaviors to be okay and just right, and you want the 2 passive avoidant behaviors to be as low as possible. So quite often I always think 5 fantastic, 2 okay, 2 want them as small as possible. It's the easiest way to remember. 9 factors making up the full range leadership model. When they're done in the right combination, as in you get the 3 outcomes you're looking for, which is extra effort, effectiveness, and satisfaction. So what are those 5 transformational behaviors made up of? Well, the first one, and the most sort of well-known one, is building trust. Then after that comes acting with integrity, followed by inspiring others. The 4th one, encouraging innovation, and the 5th one, coaching people. Now, these 5 transformational behaviors or factors have been found to increase the level, when they're demonstrated by leaders, to increase the level of satisfaction, effectiveness, and extra effort. And in fact, the evidence tends to indicate that the transformational behaviors tend to be highly correlated with extra effort. So transformational leaders, people will do more for a transformational leader than they would for a regular leader, or maybe a transactional leader, autocratic leader, bureaucratic leader, passive avoidant leader. And so we know from the evidence and the research that these transformational behaviors actually increase extra effort, effectiveness, and satisfaction. Now, what I normally get is, okay, that's great, Mike, but how does that help me as a coach? Well, when you look at the full range leadership model and you look into the MLQplus report, you will see that it actually identifies the 4 behaviors that make up trust. 4 behaviors that make up acting with integrity, 4 behaviours that make up inspiring others, 4 behaviours that make up encouraging innovative thinking, and 4 behaviours that go with coaching people. So it's fairly easy to very quickly look into those behaviours in the report and identify the areas which are strong and the areas which are not so strong, and target your coaching to those areas. I'll give an example, most probably for me is the easiest, because it's where I always start with my clients. And it's one of the behaviours in acting with integrity. So when you look at the report, you will see that there is a score or for the 360, or an individual, if the person has done an individual MLQplus. And one of those behaviours, or the first behaviour, is does this individual talk about their values and beliefs? And this is where I'm going to sort of dip in and out of coaching as I move through the model to describe to you what we've MLQplus, what we've found to work, anecdotally what the evidence and research tells us, and also my own personal experience in this area, 30 years coaching in the leadership space. Fundamentally, I believe that any good transformational leader, any good leader, has to have a clear understanding of what their values and beliefs are. In the end, when you come to make the difficult decision, those decisions about how you're going to articulate that, how you're going to explain it to your employees or the people who work for you, how you're going to be okay with it or not okay with it, comes down to what do you know about yourself. So this level of self-awareness. So for me, if a leader is not self-aware enough to know or even have done the work into their own value and belief systems and can articulate that and say things like, well, I always find that difficult because I find laziness really difficult to handle, because I'm pretty driven, I'm pretty smart. I appreciate that everybody else isn't, but for me it's a difficult thing, so maybe I'm taking this a little bit the wrong way. If a leader's not able to do that and go, what do I know about myself, my own values and my own beliefs, they can't really judge whether the decisions that they're making are based on something else, or they're based on, actually, the evidence tells me this, I'm always going to find that difficult to accept because it's contrary to my belief system. But even so, I can do this or I can do that. 2, actually, this is totally contrary to my beliefs and I don't want to be part of it. So I'll give an example from a recent meeting that I was at. I was being persuaded to endorse a leader who, it transpired, had made some pretty derogatory, sexist, misogynistic remarks about some of the female employees. This, as it transpired through the conversation, this leader was commonly known to make those sort of remarks, not only in private, but also publicly, quite often in front of women. So a lot of the employees of this leader believed that he was pretty sexist in his attitudes. I found it very difficult to support the decision that was being made to keep this person in their job. I fundamentally believed that he needed to be made aware of that, he needed to be challenged, and his behaviour needed to be addressed. And that if he chose to carry on like that, that was his decision. But he would now know what was expected of him, and he could decide to either change his behaviour or not. And so for me, that's an example of where being aware of my beliefs around it made me a little bit cautious about, was I pushing too hard? But at the same time, actually this is what I firmly believe is the right thing to do in this space, and that's what I stand on. And so therefore a leader who might score very low on the MLQ plus about talking about their values and beliefs, it might be that they're not clear about their values and beliefs. And in the coaching space, that's what I try to find out. Are they clear? If they are, do they actually talk about that to their employees and talk about values and belief with their employees, with their peers, maybe even with their boss? What I do find, particularly amongst the more sophisticated leaders, is that they are very clear about values and beliefs. They understand the importance of values and maintaining those values, and also how that drives their decision making. But what they're not so good at is about talking about it with other leaders, with their peers, with their subordinates, or even having a conversation with their subordinates around what are that subordinates' values and what's important to them. And therefore going, now I understand why they behave the way they do, or they say what they do, or why, it's 5 o'clock and they're out the door because family is more important to them than anything else. Or that they said they would do something, so they will do it. And therefore this understanding that comes from the fundamental value of investigating values and beliefs doesn't get talked about. And so quite often it's coaching them into, well, the way to improve this is to have the conversation. In most cases, they get there on their own with a little bit of coaching, but sometimes I've had to give them a bit of prod in the right direction and say, well, I get that you're clear about it, but you're obviously not talking about it to other people because it's not coming out here in the result. The other one that comes up most probably in the same area is about building trust. It is fundamental to any leadership model, I would argue, and particularly to the transformational model. So I believe that the transformational model stands on building trust, and part of that is that you demonstrate that you go beyond self-interest, that you are looking for the good of the group or the team, and not just after yourself. We've all heard people who say that, I'm for the team, and then they demonstrate something very counter to that. That diminishes trust. They also, transformational leaders act in ways that builds others' respect for them. So if they say they're going to do something, no matter how hard or difficult it is, they actually do it, or they'll actually say, look, I'm really sorry, but that's just not going to happen. I know you don't like it, and I know you find that very difficult, but in this situation, given everything that I've told you, it's not going to happen. And they stick to that. Sometimes delivering the difficult message can help build respect. And so in the trust area, the 4 behaviours become critical because they're almost the foundation that everything else stands on. So from a coaching point of view, right at the beginning, I'm trying to find out how self-aware the client is. How much they know about themselves, how much development work they've done, how much work they've done to understand why they are like they are, and how it drives their behaviours on a daily basis. Quite often their reaction to the MLQplus report, sometimes if you've used other psychometrics or other tools to gather evidence, sometimes you're called in as the coach because they're going through a disciplinary process or at the end of a disciplinary process. Sometimes you're called in because leaders are just not happy about their performance. There's all sorts of reasons why you're called in, but invariably I find that my first challenge is to, one, find out how self-aware the individual is, and then once I've really worked out how self-aware they are, actually how much are they really consciously thinking about, I have to get these people who don't know me or don't know me well to trust me. And the more they trust me, the more likely I am to get my result. So they start to think as a transformational leader, which is it starts with themselves and it's their responsibility to build the trust. It's not somebody else's responsibility to trust them individually. Great if you've got a team of people who are high in trust and trust you on face value. It's great. But my experience is that most employees are not like that. And if you're a good leader, you quite often get put into teams because they're dysfunctional. And they're dysfunctional in most cases because there's a breach of trust, a breakdown of trust, they don't trust each other, and all the other things that come out of that. And so as the leader trying to build trust, you have to be really conscious of what you're trying to do. The great thing about the full range leadership model and the MLQ Plus is it gives you the 4 behaviours that you need to demonstrate in order to build trust. And when you build trust, demonstrating the 4 behaviours, you start to get the 3 outcomes. More. Yep, you got it. Come on. You want me to give it to you again? Okay, more extra effort, more effectiveness, and more satisfaction. They're always the 3 outcomes that the MLQ Plus is measuring. So all the way along, you're going, if you do this, you get that. And that is what the research and all the evidence tells us about MLQ Plus. Over 5,000 different studies across multiple journals that actually say, yeah, MLQ Plus is measuring what it says it's measuring, and these are the outcomes that you'll get if you demonstrate these behaviors. And so it's really easy for each of them. There are 4 behaviors. For me, self-awareness and that level of self-awareness in the coaching space is the first one, and the one behind that is trust. And do they understand trust? Now, depending on what you've got in the report is where you'll go with the other transformational behaviors. One that comes up quite a lot, particularly between quite senior leaders, is they don't have time to coach and develop people. And you will quite often see help others to develop their strengths is quite low because they've never really sat down with a conversation that's been targeted at, these are the people that report to me, and you know what, I'm going to find out what they think their strengths are, what I think their strengths are, and we're going to have a discussion about that so we're really clear and how I'm going to help them develop even greater in the strengths area. So quite often it will be like, and what did you do about that? How did you go about it? You notice this score is just slightly lower than all the others. What does that mean? It's quite noticeable that the score is lower with your subordinates. So what does that say? Oh, well, you know, I don't really have time. I only get to see them once a fortnight for an hour. You know, yep. So how would you go about developing the strengths? Obviously asking these questions, but I'm trying to use a particular model, which is to get them to a point of going, well, there are all these different options. Which options would work best for you? So which one are you actually going to use? And so for me, most probably the GROW model for coaching is the most generic and the most probably the easiest to use, particularly when I'm not really clear about what I'm going to be getting when I first meet a client. But quite often I will use that as a good model throughout. Obviously, the GROW model, you looking at what's the goal here, what are we talking about, what are the realities, so what are you dealing with? Quite often that's what the report is telling us. The reality is your subordinates say you don't do this. Okay, so why would you want to do this? Yeah, you want to do it. Go back to the goal. You want to do it because you want to increase the outcomes of leadership. That's what you're paid for. So you want greater satisfaction, greater effectiveness, greater extra effort. Yep. So you're going to do that by spending time coaching these people, finding out what their strengths are. So one of the things you're going to do is find out what their strengths are. How are you going to do that? What will it look like? So I've got goal to achieve the outcome. What are the realities? This is what the report's saying. You're not doing it with your subordinates. then into the options. What can you do? What can you do? And then I try to tie them down a little bit. So, okay, so by the next time I see you, given that you've got 12 direct reports and you only ever see them once a month, that's a lot of work to do. How many do you think you can do by, when I see you again in 6 weeks' time? And then they say, yep, okay. 4, 5, 6 people. I'm like, yep, that's terrific. Just so you've got an idea, and when we come back together, we can talk about what you could do about that, how you found it, how it worked, what we do about that. Obviously, there are other behaviours in the coaching area, and if you look at the MLQplus, it gives you those 4 behaviours, so it's quite easy to target. The other one that most probably comes up with the lowest score on a fairly frequent basis is in the area of encourage innovative thinking. Lots of organisations are really concerned about this one, and I get a lot of questions from CEOs in particular, but HR directors around how do we encourage innovation in our organisation? How do we get people to be more innovative? How do we get people to do things differently? How do we get to improve what we're doing and get people to really want to come forward with ideas and innovate? I always go, well, you're asking somebody who works in the leadership space, and I always go, it's all about your leaders. We know from the research and evidence from MLQplus that it is one of the transformational behaviours, how you get people to innovate. Funny enough, it's not rocket science. And the first thing to understand is that leaders, transformational leaders, do not have to be innovative themselves. It's great if they are, but they don't have to be. And I love it because, like all the behaviors in the MLQplus, it is not about your personality. It is not about I'm an extrovert, I'm an introvert. I'm really high on trust, I'm really low on trust. I'm, low on self-discipline. It is not about your personality. It is about a behavior, and you can learn to change your behavior. I can learn to behave like an introvert. I will always be an extrovert, but can learn to behave like an introvert. I coach people, and I spend maybe 45 minutes of an hour session listening to people talk. I might only speak for 4 or 5 minutes in an average coaching session if I'm asking the right questions and I'm encouraging in the right way. It depends on the client. But that's a real challenge for somebody who's an extrovert to not talk and try and fill in the silence. But I've learnt these behaviours. Equally, innovative thinking is a set of behaviours. It's something that the leader needs to do for other people, rather than, I need to be innovative, so I need to think differently, and I need to alter who I am, and it's not my thing. I'm not really innovative. Well, that's great. You don't have to be innovative. You just have to do certain things. And one of them is just actually asking questions. So it's when somebody goes, well, I think we always do A, B, and C, for the leader to say, well, yeah, I get that we always do A, B, and C, but what if we were to do it differently? What if we were to do something completely different to get this outcome? So we do A, B, and C, and we get this outcome. Is there something, we still want the same outcome, but could we do it differently, more efficiently, faster, quicker, slower, whatever else it is? Just to ask the question, rather than go, yep, that's great, is to ask the question. In most cases, leaders look at you as if to say, really, it's that simple? It is that simple. What we know is that leaders who ask, could we do this differently and save time, money, energy, what would that look like, actually get answers that save time, energy, money, etc. And it's that simple, is to ask. As the coach, getting them to understand that you're not asking them to be different. You're not asking them to change their personality and change who they are. What you're asking them to do is, if you want this outcome, 3 outcomes for transformational leadership, always the same: extra effort, effectiveness, and satisfaction. So it increases all 3. All you have to do if you want to increase innovation, so people feel more involved, more valued because you're listening to their ideas and they're putting them forward, is to ask them for their ideas. It seems really simple, but lots of managers, lots of leaders are just too busy. And a lot of time think that they need to be the expert. The thing is, as a leader, you don't have to be the expert to be a great leader. If you're a technical specialist, you need to be a great technician. As a leader, you need to be great at asking questions and getting people involved. As a transformational leader, what you're trying to do is move people into a position where they trust you and feel like if they put forward an idea, they're not going to get shot down in flames, even if it's a crap idea. And so therefore, as the leader, if you ask the question, somebody will answer it. Might always not be a great answer, but at least you're getting an answer, and you can reward them for giving you an answer. And they'll feel valued and trust you more. And therefore, you get the outcomes you're looking for. The other one, most probably, is leaders looking at things or encouraging people to look at things from a different perspective or in a different way. So we always do this a particular way. Could we do it differently? So having a different perspective. Are we looking at this in one particular way, and could we look at it differently? In most cases, if it's the first time you've ever said this in a meeting, everybody's going to look at you with stunned silence. If you're lucky, somebody might speak up. But in most cases, leaders need to be coached into this in order to go, just ask the question. If you don't get any answers, just go, that's fantastic. When you go away today, if you think there's a different way of looking at this, a different way of investigating it or solving this problem than we normally do it, if there's a different approach that we haven't taken, and you think about it overnight or in a week's time, please come and see me. I'd really love to know. And when they do come and see you, make time to listen, and obviously. So what you're doing all the time with the coachee in this is trying to target particular behaviours that build the transformational behaviours. Because the larger the transformational behaviours, the larger the result that they're going to get. When you get to the transactional behaviours that make up the full range leadership model and part of the MLQplus report, there's a balancing act. And this is where particularly the very concrete, very tangible leaders who sometimes struggle with the touchy-feely element of transformational leadership. And, we'll talk about, I'm not particularly good in the empathy space, or I'm not particularly good around this stuff. And, I'm expected to be the technical expert. They find the transactional pretty easy to get their head around. It's trying to get them to understand why it needs to be okay and not as big as possible. Obviously, rewards achievement needs to be fairly high. So when we look at the model, it's between 2 and 3 as a score. And monitoring mistakes, which is the other transactional behavior, is at the other end of the scale, and you want it to be between 1 and 2. Obviously, if you're all the time monitoring mistakes, there's something very wrong going on, and you need to look at that. And so if the person's score is too high, you look at the behavior behind that. Again, 4 behaviors for monitoring mistakes and 4 behaviors for rewards achievement. And you sometimes find, particularly in safety critical uh, uh, um, industries, particularly like energy, so water, electricity, gas, that are very safety critical. Aviation is another one. To a certain extent, even high risk environments um, are normally pretty safety critical. The scores tend to be slightly higher because people expect the monitoring of mistakes to go on in order to minimize the risk in a safety critical industry. So that's why quite often when you are ordering an MLQplus results, you need to think about which group this individual should be in. Because obviously, if you click on the energy sectors, the norm group that they're compared against is different to the norm group in a non-safety critical industry. So when they look at the norms, although against the researched norm, they should be between 2 and 3, and obviously for monitoring mistakes, 1 and 2. Against the norm groups of their industry, they might come out being equivalent to higher or lower. And that gives you some way of balancing the discussion because it's not unusual for particularly leaders in the safety critical industries to defend why their monitoring mistakes is as high as it is. And some of them can have a score of 3 plus and defend it quite vigorously as that's my job. Well, is your job just to monitor mistakes? Given that you're leading people as well, what's it like when the only conversation you have with your leader is about a mistake? What would that be like? Equally, on the obverse, you don't want rewards achievement to be too high, because if the only thing that your leader ever says to you is, fantastic job, Mike, thanks very much, you were brilliant, and you go, that's great, but how do I develop? How do I improve? Where's the coaching? Where's the support to, yeah, you keep on telling me I'm great and everything else, but you never ask me about my opinion or my ideas or what's interesting. So only gets you, rewarding achievement only gets you so far. It's transactional. It's transactional because that's exactly what it is. If I give you $50 to mow my lawn, you ain't going to go and trim the hedge because you're still going to get $50. You might do it once, and I go, thank you very much, that's very nice, but I'm still going to give you $50 because that was the deal. Now, if you're sensible, you think, well, I'll just mow your lawn. Some people will carry on, trimming the hedge, and eventually I expect you to mow my lawn and trim my hedge for $50 because you did it for 3 weeks. Why have you suddenly stopped doing it? And so this is where you can get into a dodgy area if you're relying on transactional behaviours only. So the rewards achievement wants to be okay in the right area between 2 and 3. So you want to be doing enough of it, expressing satisfaction when they meet their expectations. So I asked you to mow the lawn. Fantastic job. Thank you very much. Here's your $50. Here's your £50, whatever else it is, whatever country you're watching this from. But equally, it only gets you so far. On the other side of the coin, monitoring mistakes, you want it to be between 1 and 2, because in reality, if you're doing it all the time, it's very demotivating for individuals. That's the only conversation that they have. Yes, you do have to do some of it. And obviously, when somebody's consistently making errors, or as I call it, going below the bar, you need to address it. So you need to be thinking about, well, do I have to have a performance discussion? Is this serious? Actually, is this person up to the job? Quite often in the coaching environment, particularly, I will work with the leader to go, well, what sort of questions would you ask? Where would you do? How would you find this out? And I always use skill or will. So I sort of say, well, what about how do you find out whether it's a skill deficiency? They just don't know how to do it. So they've never learnt. Nobody's ever shown them. This is all new to them. 2, they've got the skills. You know they have. You've given them the training. They just don't want to do it. And how can you motivate them? How can you engage them? Can you do that? If not, what are you going to do about it? And sometimes that's about performance management and getting your HR department and various other individuals involved is necessary around that. But I'm always trying to coach the client into understanding that these transactional behaviors are useful and necessary if you work in an organization, particularly in senior leadership roles, but only in moderation. They only get you so far. Yet they do have an impact on effectiveness because people are very clear about what they should be doing and shouldn't be doing. Equally, they do affect people's satisfaction because people like to know if they're doing a good job or not. So if they're getting regular feedback, etc., that falls into that same area in the transactional space. But it only gets you so far. The bit that really generates the high levels of satisfaction, effectiveness, and extra effort are the transformational behaviors which you want to be doing as much of. And if you're spending a lot of time doing transactional, you don't have a lot of time for transformational. Whereas if you have a lot of time for transformational, it takes very little energy to do the transactional bit. You still have to do it, but it takes very little energy. Finally, we come to the dark side, as some people call it, and what we call the passive avoidant behaviors. These are the behaviors that you want to minimize as much as possible. And quite often in the report, particularly leaders who have been dropped into dysfunctional teams, leaders who've been put into very difficult situations, new teams, merged teams, teams where people have been made redundant, teams that have been actually moved, so they've joined even a different organization. They can really struggle in this space because their scores can sometimes look pretty bad. And it is about, in the coaching space, just investigating around, okay, well, you know, you've got a sort of pretty high score, 2, 3, for you don't respond to urgent inquiries or questions, particularly your subordinates or particularly your peers are saying this. And they're just like, I don't have time, I'm overwhelmed, I don't have time to respond to emails. Most of the time, I'm racing from one disaster to another. Doing the job of 3 people. There's might be a whole lot of reasons around that, and quite often investigates that. How do you get on top of this? How do you move from being in a disaster area where you're just clearing up mess, to doing? So they're doing a lot of doing, and they're not focusing on the transformational behaviors at all. And it is by going, well, all that can wait, and focusing on the transformational. It's very rare that you'll see in the report that somebody who has relatively high scores in the passive avoidant behaviors, again, 4 behaviors for fighting fires and 4 behaviors for avoiding getting involved. It's very rare that you will see, it's very rare that you will see high scores in the passive avoidant behaviors and high scores in the transformational behaviors. Normally, a high score in the passive avoidant will impact somewhere in the transformational behaviors and will have an impact on the outcomes, and it's not unusual for it to impact all 3, but satisfaction seems to be We've got some evidence for it, but it's still not solid and reliable. That it has a fairly big impact on satisfaction. So as a coach, what you're trying to do all the time is develop the transformational behaviours to be as big as possible. And the way to do this is to look at the report and ask some questions around a particular behaviour. It is quite often stressing to the client that it's not about their personality. You're not asking them to change who they are, what they believe in, how they do something or say something, or who they are. It is more around, if you want to get this outcome, as a leader, you are employed to get this outcome. They'll do more for you because you're a great leader than they will for a bad leader. You know this anecdotally, that if somebody asks you to do something and you've got a relationship with them or you think you're going to get something out of it, you're more likely to do it than somebody who's a total bastard and you think, well, I'm really sorry, but if you're going to ask me to stay back on Friday night, I'm going to find an excuse because you treat me like shit and I'm not going to get anything out of it. I'm just being used here. And so it makes total sense that leaders who care about and spend time developing, are genuinely interested in their people, will get extra effort. And this is the key about transformational leadership for most people, is that one, transformational leadership generates these three outcomes. And that's really what leaders are being paid for. Management is something completely different and a whole different discussion about what it means to be a manager. Transformational leadership, or leadership in my opinion, is all about engaging. You are paid as a leader to engage these people in such a way, regardless of what job you do, you engage with the team or the people that you work with in order to get these outcomes. Extra effort out of your people so they're more productive, they'll do more for you, therefore they do more for the organization, and that's what you're being paid for. You've quite often heard people say, I'll do it for you, Mike, but I won't do it for the organization. And you're like, well, okay, but in effect you are doing it for the organization because that's what I'm paid for. They might believe that they're doing it for me, but in the end, when we go to surveys and everything else and we ask people about, so why did you leave the organization? You say it's shitty, or they weren't fair, or there was a hostile environment or a toxic environment. What do you mean? They talk about the leader. And so therefore, the obverse of that is, why do you love this organization? Why did you stay with this organization for 20 years? Why do you do this? When you ask them and get down to it, in most cases, it's because they work for a great leader. They've got leaders who, will, take the organizational line and do things, but they do it in such a way that it engages the employees. And this is what transformational leadership is all about. It's transforming individuals from going, I'm just a pawn in a game here, to actually, I determine what's happening here. I've got influence, people are genuinely interested in me, I've got something to offer, and therefore they develop and they become better at whatever they do, and they move on and they get promoted and they stay with the organization because they love working with in that kind of environment. And so generating this transformational leadership environment actually affects all those things: effectiveness, extra effort, productivity for all intents and purposes, and of course satisfaction. From a coaching perspective, I'm always focusing on the behaviours. So I'm really clear that what I'm trying to do is coach the individual. I use the GROW model to do that. into developing that behavior. Sometimes they already know it, they're just not demonstrating it often enough or clearly enough to the people who are rating them. So sometimes their peers will never have seen them coach. So quite often I'll say, to a senior executive team member, well, when you're sitting around the executive table, do you tell or do you coach? And they're like, well, hold on a second. This is what we're talking about. Your peers are saying you don't do this. Well, the only time you actually interact with your peers as such is when you're sitting around that executive table. How do you change that? So they think, actually, he doesn't tell. Yeah, actually, quite often he will be asking all these questions and going what we do and how we do it, and don't quite know what he does, but she's very good at this. She tends to think in this particular way. She'll give plenty of time and listen to what you've got to say. She'll always ask these questions. Actually, yeah, I have seen her fairly often to frequently, 3s and 4s. And suddenly the scores start moving up. Not only that, is those individuals, if you ask them, most probably like that approach than rather being told. Now, it depends on the culture of the organisation, of course, and quite often when you're coaching particularly executive teams, part of my job is to shift the culture of the organisation by shifting the culture of the executive team. But that's another area of transformational leadership completely separate from what we're talking about today, and I'll talk about it in another blogcast at some stage. If you've got any questions, please feel free to email me and put them forward. If you'd like to hear me talk about something in particular, please get in touch with us as well, and I'm sure I'll be able to do something for you. From my point of view, I'm quite passionate about this stuff. 30 years of working in the leadership space, working with really exciting organizations. I've seen how organizations can transform themselves from autocratic, transactional, managerial organizations to transformational, leadership led organizations. And I'm talking about government departments, civil service, really entrenched managerial organizations that really are full of people who go, no, I joined to be a manager, not a leader. What the hell's that got to do with me and who I am? And moving them into that place using MLQplus is one of those things that takes time and a fair bit of skill. But in my experience, once people get there, they are normally a little bit gobsmacked and a little bit about, oh, why didn't somebody tell me about this 20 years ago? I can't believe I spent 20 years of my career and I never understood this. And for most people, transformational leadership, when they get it and they actually see it work and they're like, oh my God, it is for them transformational as well, which is what it's all about. So please, if you've got any questions, come back to me. Otherwise, hopefully, I'll see you in the next web or blog. See you then. Bye.